The fortune teller had read 40,000 cards in 30 years. But when she reached the final card of Wing's mother's deck, she pressed her hand flat across it and refused to turn it over. It wasn't fear that kept her hand there. It was the realization that the debt tied to that card had been accumulating interest for 33 years, and that turning it would finally bring the collector to the door. In the cramped, incense-heavy air of a hidden Macau shop, Wing discovers that the unlucky reading she inherited from her mother wasn't a prediction, it was a contract. This is the story of the reading that was never finished, the silence left behind in a Macau backstreet, and what happens when you finally stop avoiding the fate you were told to outrun. The fortune teller had read 40,000 cards in 30 years, and she put her hand flat over the deck and said she would not turn the last one. Wing watched her palm press down on the red cloth, fingers spread, knuckles white at the edges. 39 cards lay turned face up in a careful arc. The 40th waited under Auntie IP's hand, untouched. The shop front sat 2 streets back from the Largo do Senado, down an alley narrow enough that Wing's shoulders nearly brushed both walls. No sign marked it. Wing had found the address in her mother's handwriting, on the back of a faded receipt, tucked into a drawer she'd only opened because her mother could no longer open it herself. Wing collected debts for a living. She knew the look of an account that had gone unpaid too long, the particular weight it carried, the way people avoided mentioning it until they couldn't avoid it anymore. Her mother's receipt had that weight. A date in 1991, a name, a single Cantonese word meaning unfinished. She had not expected the place to still exist. She had not expected the woman behind the counter to know her mother's name before Wing said it. Auntie IP was older than the receipt, older than the building, old enough that her hands had the particular steadiness of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything decades ago. She listened to Wing's explanation. The dying mother, the unfinished spinners, the need, professional and personal, to close what was open without interrupting. Then she nodded once and brought out a deck wrapped in red silk. The cards were bok the, a traditional fortune-telling method using numbered bamboo slips or cards, still practiced in temples and back alley shops across southern China and Macau, where each card corresponds to a fixed verse interpreted by the reader rather than the questioner. Auntie IP laid them on red cloth, one at a time, in a spread that curved like a slow river. She turned card after card. Wing watched her face for some sign of what each meant, but Auntie IP's expression didn't shift until the 39th card landed. Her hand stopped over the 40th position before it touched the deck. 39, Auntie IP said. That's enough. Wing looked at the spread. 39 cards, each interpreted aloud in a voice that had gone steadily quieter as the reading progressed. Warnings about money, then about time, then about a debt with no clear owner. The 40th card sat unturned, its back facing up, identical to all the others except for what it had not yet shown. My mother has 3 days, Wing said. Maybe less, I know, then finish it. Auntie IP's hand did not move from the table. It hovered an inch above the last card, fingers slightly curled, the posture of some protecting something rather than withholding it. Some readings, she said, are better left at 39. Wing had spent 11 years collecting debts from people who didn't want to pay them. She knew the sound of someone trying to close a conversation before it finished. She did not move. This account isn't mine to forgive, Wing said. It's hers, and she can't finish it herself anymore. Auntie IP looked at her for a long moment, not at her face, but lower, at her hands. The way a reader looks at the part of a person that tells the truth the mouth doesn't. You're sure, she said. It wasn't a question. Turn the card. Auntie IP's hand did not move. It stayed exactly where it was, flat on the cloth, covering the 40th position The way you cover a wound you are not ready to look at. The Polaroid had gone the color of weak tea, but the cards in it were unmistakable. 39 of them, in the same curved arc Auntie IP had just laid on the table. The 40th position was blank. Wing looked between the photograph and the cloth in front of her. Same spread, same order, 33 years apart. Auntie IP set the photograph down carefully, the way you set down something that has outlived its frame. The glass on her altar had a rectangle of unfaded color where the photo had sat, protected from light for so long that the surrounding wood had bleached around it. 1991, she said. Your mother came in March, before the rains. Wing did the arithmetic without meaning to. 1991. She had been born in 1992. She wasn't pregnant yet, Auntie IP said, watching Wing's face do the same math she'd just done herself. She asked about a daughter she hadn't had. What would become of her? What kind of woman she'd grow into? A pause. People come to me with strange questions. That one wasn't unusual. Macau in 1991 was a city of rolling brownouts. The Portuguese-administered territory's aging electrical grid struggled through the rainy season every year, district by district. On a rotation, residents learned to plan around. Auntie IP's street lost power twice a week that spring, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for most of a night. It happened in the middle of the 39th card. The lights went, Auntie IP said. Just the lights, nothing dramatic. I lit a candle, the kind I keep behind the counter for exactly that reason. And when I looked back at the table, your mother had her hand over the last card. She paused. Same as you tried to do, except she wasn't asking me to stop. She'd already decided. What did she say? She said she'd come back to finish it. Auntie IP folded her hands on the table, the gesture of someone reaching the part of a story they have told to themselves, more often than to anyone else. She never came back. The shop had stayed open. Auntie IP had read for thousands of other people across 3 decades. Debt collectors and dock workers and tourists from the casinos who wanted to know about luck before they spent money they shouldn't. But the spread from March 1991 stayed exactly where she'd left it, pinned under glass, 39 cards and 1 gap. Because in her trade, an unfinished reading isn't nothing, it's a debt. Uncollected fate, she called it. A reading that has been started, paid for, and abandoned before its outcome could settle into the world. The fate doesn't disappear. It waits, unclaimed, the way money waits in an account nobody closes. Wing looked again at the Polaroid, then at the spread on the table in front of her. She set them side by side. Card for card, they matched. The same sequence, the same orientation, down to the slight tilt of the 7th card, which in both layouts leaned a few degrees off the others, as if it had been placed by the same unsteady hand, 33 years apart. You laid the same spread, Wing said. On purpose. I didn't lay anything. Auntie IP's voice had gone very quiet. I shuffled the deck before you arrived. I cut it the way I always cut it. I turned the cards as they came. Wing's eyes went to the 40th position in the old photograph, the gap that had sat empty under glass for 33 years, waiting the way her mother now lay waiting in a hospital bed across the city, also unfinished, also overdue. It had always been empty, not blank, not unphotographed, empty the way a held breath is empty, not absence, but suspension, a thing deliberately not yet let go. The line in the utility report read, reading suspended at subject's request. Wing read it 3 times. It was typed in the same flat municipal font as everything else on the page. Incident number, district code, date, sitting in a field, meant for technical cause of failure. The archive occupied a basement room in a government annex that smelled like dust and humidity-warped paper. Wing came here often for work. Debt records, property liens, the kind of documentation that survived people far longer than memory did. She knew how to read these files the way other people knew how to read faces. She had requested the 1991 outage records for the district around the Largo do Senado, expecting routine bureaucratic dryness. Macau's power grid in that era failed often enough that the brownouts barely made local news. A known weakness of the territory's aging infrastructure under Portuguese administration, fixed gradually through the following decade. She expected a transformer fault, a line fault, something with a number attached to it. The report did list a cause: transformer fire, Rua de Terceira, March 1991. Except the report contained no transformer record, no equipment ID, no technician signature, no follow-up inspection, which every other incident in the surrounding files had, stapled neatly behind the original report, closing the case the way cases were supposed to close. This one had never been closed. The clerk, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who had clearly handled requests like this before, pulled the physical file from storage himself, the way you do when you don't trust younger staff to find something this old. He set it on the counter and watched Wing read it with the patient detachment of someone who had stopped being curious about old paperwork decades ago. Transfer fire, Wing said, but there's no transformer. He shrugged. Old files, things get summarized wrong sometimes. It says here. She turned the page toward him, reading suspended at subject's request. He read it. His expression didn't change, but he was quiet a moment longer than the sentence warranted. That's not standard language, he said. I know, that's not. He stopped, frowned. Read it again. That's not language we use, at all. I don't know why that would be typed into an outage report. He looked at the file number, the date stamp, the signature block, all of which were correctly formatted, correctly archived, indistinguishable from every other report in the box. Maybe it's a different kind of reading, he offered. Meter reading. Maybe someone abbreviated something. Wing thought about 39 cards on a red cloth and a 40th position that had sat empty under glass for 33 years. Maybe, she said. She did not believe it, and the clerk, watching her fold the photocopy into her bag with more care than the document seemed to warrant, did not entirely believe his own explanation either. She went back to the shop front at dusk, the alley narrower in the fading light, the walls closer than she remembered. Auntie IP was standing in the doorway before Wing reached it, not waiting in the casual sense, standing the way someone stands when they've heard footsteps approaching from 2 streets away and have had time to compose themselves before the person's arrives. Wing hadn't called ahead. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. You found the report, Auntie IP said. It wasn't a question. Wing held up the photocopy. It says the reading was suspended at someone's request. Not the power company's. Someone's. Auntie IP stepped back from the doorway, making room, the gesture of someone inviting a person into a conversation they had been dreading and waiting for at the same time. It was your mother, she said. She was the one who asked me to stop. Auntie IP lifted her hand from the 40th card, and underneath it, the card had already changed. It was no longer face down. It was no longer blank-backed and waiting. The card now showed a different image than the one it had shown a moment before Auntie IP's palm had covered it. Wing was sure of this, the way you're sure of small things shifting at the edge of vision, though she could not have said what the card looked like before. They sat across from each other at the table, the red cloth between them, the 39 turned cards still arranged in their curved arc. Auntie IP's hands were folded now, no longer protecting anything, the posture of someone who has decided to finish a sentence she started 3 decades ago. The 39th card, she said, showed a death. Wing's stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Whose? That's what the 40th card answers. That's what it's for. Auntie IP's voice stayed level. The practiced calm of someone who had explained difficult things to frightened people for 30 years. Your mother saw the 39th card. She understood enough to be afraid. She asked me to stop before I turned the last one, before the death had a name. You said yes. I said yes. A pause. But the trade doesn't let a reading end that easily. Not once it's begun. Not once the question has been asked and the cards have started answering. In the tradition Auntie IP had trained in, passed down through 3 generations of readers working the temples and back alleys of the Pearl River Delta, an unfinished reading isn't an aborted one. It's suspended. The question has already left the asker's mind and entered the cards. Stopping the reading doesn't return it. It only delays the cards from finishing what they started. There's a condition, Auntie IP said. Always has been. An unfinished reading must be completed by the same bloodline within one lifetime of the person who asked the question. Mother, daughter, granddaughter, it doesn't matter which, as long as the blood is unbroken and the lifetime hasn't closed. And if it isn't completed, then the card decides itself. Auntie IP looked at the 40th position, still covered by her own hand, though her eyes were on Wing now, not the table, unobserved, untethered to any single fate. It doesn't wait politely for someone to come ask. It resolves on its own terms, attached to whoever's closest to the blood when the lifetime runs out. Wing felt the shape of this settle into something specific and terrible. My mother has 3 days, she said. Maybe less. She doesn't know any of this. No, you're telling me the deadline isn't. Wing started again. You're telling me this is real, actually real. Not a metaphor for grief or closure or some old woman's way of making peace with. I'm telling you the deadline is not metaphorical, Auntie IP said. Her voice did not rise. It never had through the whole conversation, and that steadiness was somehow worse than if she'd shouted. Your mother's lifetime ends in days. The reading has to close before hers does, or the card resolves into whoever is standing closest to it when the time runs out. The shop was very quiet. Outside, the alley had gone fully dark, and the single bulb above the counter buzzed faintly, the way old wiring does in old buildings, the way it must have buzzed in March of 1991, before the lights went out the first time. Auntie IP finally lifted her hand from the 40th card. Underneath it, the card had already changed. Wing's hand found the 40th card before she decided to move it. Her fingers turned it over the way you turn over something you already suspect you won't be able to put back. It showed a red chop, a contract seal, the kind used on official Chinese and Macanese documents to mark a debt cleared, an account closed, a matter finished by mutual agreement rather than left to chase someone into the next life. Auntie IP looked at the card for a long moment before she spoke. That's not death, she said. I know what it looks like. Wing had spent 11 years staring at exactly this kind of symbol. The red ink, the square border, the character meaning settled, stamped into countless closing documents. It's a closure mark, final payment, nothing outstanding. Then maybe you should ask what the 39th card was actually showing. Wing looked back at the spread, at the card before the 40th, the one that had stopped her mother cold 33 years ago. She had assumed, the way Auntie IP had let her assume, that it showed an ending, a death with no name attached, waiting for the final card to supply one. It showed a debt, Auntie IP said, not a death. Your mother saw what she was afraid of, not what was actually there. People do that. The cards show what's true. The fear translates it. Wing pulled out her phone and called the debt collection office's archive line, a number she knew by memory, the kind of reflex that comes from 11 years of needing old records at strange hours. She gave her mother's full name and the date range, 1990 to 1992. It took the night clerk 4 minutes to find it. A personal loan, private, unregistered with any bank. The kind people in the neighborhood arranged among themselves on trust in an era before everyone had access to formal credit. The borrower's name meant nothing to Wing. The amount was modest. The notation beside it, dated 3 weeks before her mother's reading, read, "Forgiven in full." Beneath that, in a different hand, added later, "Funeral costs, family of borrower, covered, no record requested." Wing read it twice before she understood what she was looking at. "He died," she said. "The man who owed her money. He died, and instead of collecting what he owed her, she paid for his funeral, quietly. No paperwork. No one was supposed to know. She came to me 3 weeks after that," Auntie IP said, still carrying it. Still asking herself if she'd done the right thing, giving away money she didn't have to spare for a man whose family she barely knew. A pause. The 39th card showed her that death, the one she'd already lived through, already carried, already closed in her own quiet way. She just didn't recognize it as something already finished. She thought the cards were warning her about something coming. They were telling her about something she'd already done. The shop was silent, except for the faint hum of the old bulb above the counter. Wing looked at the red chop on the table, at 39 other cards that had spent 33 years protecting a story about kindness that had been mistaken by a frightened 20-something woman for a warning about loss. It wasn't predicting anything, Wing said slowly. It was recording what she did. Some readings aren't about what's going to happen, Auntie IP said. They're about what already did, before the person asking was ready to call it finished. Wing thought of her mother in the hospital bed across the city. 3 days from an ending she had carried unfinished business toward for 33 years without knowing it had a shape, a name, a red seal, waiting in a back alley shop to close it. She left before midnight to be at her mother's side. Her mother died that night quietly in her sleep. The account, both of them, finally peacefully closed. If this story stayed with you, I think it was meant to. New stories from across Asia, every week, right here. I'm Haunted East. Subscribe if you want to keep listening.